All right, can I try to score? Okay, I'm gonna try to score on that goal. Okay. Before we hop into our show, I want to thank you for your support. What we do would not be possible without you. Whether you're given $5 or $500 a month, your monthly support enables us to do what we do, to have these conversations and to grow this movement. Today, we are here in Memphis, Tennessee. We're going to hear from two individuals who are changing the economic conversation here in this city. Michael Rhodes is the author of the book, Practicing the King's Economy, Tips, Tricks, and Theology to help you enact social justice right where you are, rooted in biblical economic principles. Sarah is also an amazing individual. She's a Harvard and Yale grad that is the CEO of The Collective here in Memphis, Tennessee, creating economic pathways for flourishing in communities with young adults. Michael's also the professor of community development at Union University. You're gonna love what they both have to say. Let's come on in. Hello, everybody. I'm here today with Sarah Lockridge-Steckel and Michael Rhodes. We are here in Memphis, Tennessee. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
This is very fun.
Yeah.
This building is amazing. I really don't know where we are. Where are we even?
Yeah.
I just walked in.
So we are in Crosstown Concourse,
Okay.
which is a redevelopment in Midtown.
Midtown.
In Midtown,
Okay.
and we're in the Memphis Education Fund space, which is has about 10 different education organizations focused on either education reform or educational issues here in Memphis. And so this building was finished probably a few years ago now. It was an old Sears building that was redone to be this.
It's a pretty cool looking building.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll snap some B-roll of it outside or something like that.
They'll let you do that.
Yeah, they won't kick us off. Yeah. So how did you guys meet? You were here in Memphis. You guys are doing some really innovative, pioneering work together. Tell us the story.
Well, we were actually at a church breakfast thing, and it was...
Was there good coffee there?
There was good
Was it
coffee
Easter?
there. Maybe it was Easter.
I think it was Easter. Yeah.
And someone who knew me and my interest in work on community development and economic justice said, "Oh, you should probably meet Sarah."
Okay.
And so I was like, okay, whatever. Why should I meet you, Sarah? And she started telling me what you were doing. And I was like actually angry that you'd been at the church for 6 months and we hadn't met. Like, how could we, like, we're passionate the exact same thing.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think we emailed, and I think I emailed you more information, and Michael immediately sent it out to like 20 different people, which I really appreciated. He was like, he doesn't know me at all. And he was like, this is really cool. You need to do this and help them out, which was amazing because this was how was this, 2 years ago now?
Yeah.
This was really at the start of when we started the organization.
So you have an organization called The Collective. So tell me about that organization and what it's doing.
Yeah, so the vision of The Collective is that every young adult has the power to live their best life and the tools to make that a reality. And so we are investing in young adults and addressing poverty in our city by doing so.
Okay.
So our goal is really to get all of our young adults in our city to living wage careers and to really support them in getting to their dreams for their lives.
Yeah.
So we're both kind of on the individual side, building out pathways programs and removing some of the barriers so that people can get to where they're trying to get to. And then we're on the system side partnering with educational and employment systems and partners. So like government, employers and others to really remove some of the barriers that we're encountering.
Okay, cool. So we may talk a little bit more in depth about what you're doing.
Yeah.
But that's a great overview. And Michael, what are you doing here in the city?
Well, yeah, so the first connection was that when Sarah and I met, I had just come out of 5 years working for a nonprofit in the neighborhood where we go to church.
Okay.
That was doing job training, financial literacy, and entrepreneurship, GED support for adults. And so I was really excited to meet somebody who's doing similar work for young people. Yeah. And I was working on a book at the time called Practicing the King's Economy. That
Great book.
Thank you. With some friends, I was working on it. And one of the hooks was to try to get employers to give people chances who maybe have hard to hire obstacles. And so I think that's where we really originally connected, was around trying to get employers in our mutual networks to pay attention to The Collective. And we taught a Sunday school class together and all sorts of fun stuff.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
That's great. So you mentioned, speaking of your organization, I think on the website you shared a stat that there are 30,000 young adults in Memphis that are not working and not in school. What specifically are you doing to address that, both on a systemic level and on a pathway level?
Yeah, sure. So for individuals, we're targeting adults who are 18 to 30 who have experienced that, basically been both out of school and out of work. And we are supporting them in a year-long program to help them get to their career. And so that consists of first 10 weeks with us full-time, where we're helping you really think about where am I at? What do I need? What do I want for my life? What are some of my short-term and long-term goals? What are the options available to me? I think so many of our young adults aren't exposed to what in-demand careers are right now. And then how do I apply to school and do it in a way that's not going to saddle me with a ton of debt? So we go through all of that in those 10 weeks, and they get into certification programs with post-secondary partners like MoreTech and others, and Tech 901, to get certified in IT, healthcare, and the skilled trades fields. And we do that so that everybody kind of finishes debt-free. And we also provide really intensive coaching and twice a month leadership development and personal development here, in workshop and mentorship settings. And so we really want people to be supported and surrounded with a loving environment and folks who are both going to encourage them, but then also push them and challenge them in different ways. And most of our young adults, many of our young adults have children, have other things going on, and so they're navigating a lot of different things during this process. And so we're there to help with that. Outside of that, on the systems level, so as we were going through all of these different steps, we realized how difficult it is to get into school and get through school. I personally, so I went to college and then I went to graduate school and got my MBA, and I think it's harder to apply to post-secondary certification programs than it was for me to go through either of those. And that's like legitimately, right? Like there's a different process for every school. Every school costs something different. Every school has a different starting time frame. Quality is all over the place. And then you can end up spending $20,000-$30,000 to effectively earn $12 or $15 an hour at the end of it, right? And so how do you navigate all of that? And so on the system side, we're really trying to think about how do we streamline this process, remove barriers. I mean, it's difficult to even access basic information on websites. It doesn't exist. How do we make information available to young adults? And then on the employment side, which is a whole different kind of set of challenges, how do we make it easier to get into the in-demand jobs that exist and ensure that people thrive once they're there? So we're thinking a lot with employers about how to design more effective development opportunities, how to invest in their employees in thoughtful ways, and how to really build career pathways within organizations and institutions.
So just to get a sense of the scope of this, 30,000 young adults are not in school and not working. Now, how many, if you had to guess, how many total young adults are there in Memphis?
Well, we're a city of 600,000, so 100,000, 200,000?
So not that many.
So it could be like somewhere 15 to 30% of, that's basically not only an unemployment rate, but unemployed and not in school rate.
And what's the stat on how many of them will not attain?
So only 1% of young adults who are out of school and out of work will get an associate degree by the time they're 28. So we're really talking about, in terms of social mobility, people are not able to move from where they are to a different economic segment. And that's one of the core things that we're trying to tackle.
So you do a lot in the community, that involves both government agencies, connection with those. There was an interview that Melinda Gates did with David Letterman. And in that interview, she shared that she felt the role that philanthropy, and I'll take a little bit of liberty and include nonprofits in that, the role of that in society is to test out untested ideas. And then from there, the government's role should be to provide subsidization for the ideas that are working. In your experience, how would you view the optimal arrangement of, say, a Christian-owned nonprofit where people are trying to do good things in the community and that relationship with the government? How can those two entities work together in a systemic way to promote human flourishing?
I mean, I think it's a great question, right? I think central to that question is, what do you think the role of government should be, right? And how big of a role government should really play in people's lives. I do feel like it's government's responsibility to provide some basic social safety net for everybody, and also to provide basic services for people to be able to thrive. So that's healthcare, education, et cetera, right? And there are some fundamental things that are missing in terms of why we are in the position we're in right now. And that is largely the failure of K through 12 education to do what it was supposed to do for our young adults. I think that nonprofits do play a role filling gaps. I think the challenge is, especially with the work that we're doing, is a lot of these issues are really macroeconomic issues, right? And what I can't control, generally speaking, and what we have a hard time controlling are things like wages, tax structures, the way that our state invests in people, the options that are available, right? And all of those things matter a lot. So housing. And so I think as we think about this, I do think nonprofits and I would say churches play a fundamental role. But I think the gap is too large, and I think both government needs to play a larger role in helping to solve it, but then also the private sector does too. And the role that government can sometimes play is incentivizing or regulating employers and the private sector to play that role. And without that, capitalism left to its own devices can produce really bad outcomes, in particular for poor people in our country.
Yeah, and I think that I like the way that you put that, because it seems to me like, you know, sometimes the conversations about what should the government do and what should the nonprofit assume that like we already are good at that thing that we're supposed to be doing, when the reality is a lot of times neither of those parties is skilled at delivering. And so we're in a phase where we need innovation and experimentation. So from my mind, like the collective it's like proof of concept. It's demonstrating if you invest in young adults these ways, you can create this kind of change, and you can't create these kinds of change. So that proof of concept can be adopted by other nonprofit providers, but also by government providers, which have scale. I mean, you might disagree, but to me, I think you're breaking new ground. And that's what I like about that Gates quote. It's like sometimes we're saying, we're thinking about in terms of dollars, who should spend which dollars. The reality is we don't always know how to spend the dollars so that they solve the actual problem.
That implies that dollars always fix things.
There's a lot of people spending money on workforce development that's not working. Whereas what the collective's doing appears to be working. You know?
I do think there are downsides to philanthropy too, right? So it sometimes allows people to avoid the core issues because they are giving money and are investing in solutions, right? So instead of actually tackling wages, or instead of actually tackling how corporations are structured and organized, I'm going to give money to address the fact that corporations are only employing people in part-time ways or not paying them enough, right? And that's not a true solution to what we're talking about.
That's right.
Yeah. So here's a question that just came to mind as we're talking to all this. A lot of these solutions that you're looking to build are systemic in nature. How do you, and I'll open this up to both of you guys, how do you feel that we can leverage as people, as church leaders or community leaders, how can we leverage data to make sure we're actually trying to solve the right problems that are going to be the ones that are going to unlock the greatest systemic change, as opposed to just Band-Aid solutions that are maybe politically driven or things like that?
I mean, I think my only two contributions to that question. One is just to say that I think that churches are some of the few institutions in our society that are permanently in the people business, right? Like churches are the only organization that, you know, Lord willing, you're born into them, you die in them, you never graduate, you never get promoted. It's a lifelong, it's like your family, right? And that means that churches play an irreducible role in the people work, right? Like, and so the nonprofit community, we try to bring relational stuff in, but we still have like a time period and like a theory of change. There's a beginning and an end, and now you're off in the world. Whereas churches really can play a role of like social fabric kind of stuff. So I think, and so I think that the human component is a place that cannot be replaced. And the other thing I think is that churches and faith communities have a role in this experimentation. So like, I'm glad there are public hospitals. As far as I understand it, those were originally the church's idea. I don't think the fact that the church and early monastic communities and stuff were the original social innovators around healthcare means that that's the only way that we should do healthcare for forever, right? Like you can say, and I would say, we really need major public sector investment in healthcare and structural systems. But it's not surprising to me that there were small groups of Christians who were on the front end of innovating some of that stuff. So that's oftentimes I think about, like, we should be in the places where people are suffering, and we should be innovatively creating communities of solidarity amidst that suffering. And that's how we'll know what the real problems are. And then to the world around us, we're saying, like, come and see, come and help, come and look. You know, but I'm not into this, like, territorial, well, no, the church should be doing that, no, the government should be like that kind of, like, hard boundary. Right. I think those are armchair arguments that people have when they're not in the work. Right? Like,
you don't get the luxury of that. So,
Yeah. I think data is incredibly important, and I think data has been used a lot more, I would say, in the nonprofit space in the last 10, 20 years. I think what you're saying around the humanity side of it is also really important. I think sometimes we can boil things down to a set of statistics or simple numbers, and they're really complicated issues.
Sure.
And I think that the church lends and gives humanity to everyone. Both, whereas when you're outside of it, it can be like there's good and bad, there's evil and there's good, and then there's people who are like doing things to be, and yes, there are things that are happening that are not great, and people are doing things that damage other people, but I think the church offers both grace and love in the midst of that, and allows us a framework by which to process both some of the data and to think about how to use it. Because I think data can be used both for good and it can also be used for bad.
And when it's attached to relationships, it becomes, I think, more likely to be used in a way that contributes positive value to society.
Can I just say that an organization I used to work for called Advanced Memphis that I think does really stellar work. You know, they've had some impact-oriented studies done on them with data, which are kind of, the kind of like top tier, like really excellent stuff, and they're showing that they have some really good data. But what's interesting is that organization is 20 years old, so they weren't outcome-based managed with that data from the beginning. Like from the beginning, they had a set of principles.
Like, they're
be
more
in a place,
values-driven.
love your neighbor, serve people no matter what, dignity, work, these things, and like. That's actually what drove the evolution of the organization. So I think there needs to be a balance between paying attention to what data we can glean, but also recognizing, you know, at the end of the day, there are some core values that drive, at least for people of faith, like there are some core values that drive what we do no matter what.
You know?
100%.
No, I think that's really significant, even if you look at some of the ways that money is made in this country. Like if we just go off, you know, I'll use like Facebook as an example, and sometimes I pick on them, but it's the tall poppy syndrome. You know, how they determine their algorithms is they do testing. You know, there's not just one version of Facebook floating around. There's, I don't know, thousands of versions, and they'll test it and say, okay, which one gets better adoption and better retention for users on there, and they'll say, okay, if that beat this version of Facebook, let's use that one more. But if there are no underlying principles about human dignity, and you know, hey, maybe it's not great for people to be addicted to their smartphones at the expense of their families, then we don't really have a philosophical or theoretical framework by which to not just do what makes us most money. And so I think values are basically what an organization is willing to stand by, even if it makes them less money. And even if the data says something else should be better.
As I think Dr. King talked about, improved means to inferior ends. And I think that's, you know, sums up a lot of what is going on in our country. We're getting better and better and better at more and more questionable
and I mean,
goals.
like, capitalism itself, right, is about deriving the most value you can out of something, whether that's a person or capital, right? And so what do you have to counter that, if not more a values-based system or moralistic principles, right? Like, what else? Right? And that changes the decisions that you'll make, hopefully.
Absolutely. So speaking of capitalism, I've got some questions about the current economic situation, and then maybe after we talk through some of these, I want to talk through some Old Testament stuff. And so get with the current. You mentioned capitalism. You know, maybe not working the way that it should. You Michael introduced me to Catherine Tanner and her talk, the Christianity and the New Spirit of Capitalism, and in that talk she mentioned about how a lot of these, whether it's payday loans or different things, the people that are issuing them actually don't benefit when people pay them off right away. It's better if they actually delay the payback, because then those loans essentially become commoditized and sold to investors who can be able to make income streams off of them. That reminds me a lot of chattel slavery, which basically commodified the bondage of humans. So how do we, given that capitalism is not creating equal opportunity for all, how do we stop these vicious cycles?
Please keep it to 3 sentences.
I mean, I don't know if I would say, like, I think you started with the framing, like, capitalism isn't working. I mean, I think capitalism is working how it's set up to work. And I think if left alone to its own devices, you can see how people would set up certain systems, or you would see how, if your goal is just to maximize profit, I'm going to set this up so that I incentivize people to take it because there's some like zero interest quick repayment, and then I'm going to triple the fines on the back end so that when they miss it, I'm going to make 3 times as much, and then I'm going to build on additional systems in terms of investments to be able to capitalize off of that. Right? I mean, all of these things kind of go together. I do think this is where government matters a lot in terms of regulation, really thinking about how do we set something up that works for everyone. We do need debt to some degree for certain things, but like when we talk about student loan debt, how do we have some control over that? How do we be thoughtful about school prices ballooning? How can we be thoughtful about the limits by which you should have interest rates or a lot of these sort of really exploitative practices? But I mean, capitalism there are winners and losers, and so I think we have to have a real conversation about how do you set up society in such a way where everyone can win in some form or fashion. And even in capitalism, when decisions are made that can benefit people, sometimes they're not made for purely moralistic reasons. So I think about Ford,
Many
right?
times.
So Ford, they have a fascinating model in Detroit. I'm from Detroit, where they started paying people more, right? But their main driver of paying people more was twofold. One, to reduce turnover, so they could have a much more stable workforce because they were having productivity issues and they weren't able to produce cars and they weren't able to sell those cars in turn. But also, they knew if they created incentives that people would take all the money they're making off of Ford and spend it on Ford cars, right? And so those things go together. I do think that that's still more beneficial to that person who's earning a decent living and able to support their family and have transportation. But you have to be thoughtful about the upsides and the downsides to capitalism and real about it. It's the way things are currently operating. It's not working for everyone, and especially if you add on generational wealth disparities and racism in terms of our country, it creates an entirely different dynamic.
Yeah. I mean, I'm of two minds of this. On the one hand, I think, the emergence of market economies has led to a massive increase of wealth, and on a global scale, a lot of that has benefited some of the very poorest people who are not as poor as they used to be, right? And I don't think that is to be sniffed at. But I hate kind of the conversation because I feel like we deal in ideal types, and there is no free market capitalism. It existed nowhere in the world. I mean, if you just think about the fact that I think it's like the United States military has like the same budget as like an enormous country, right? And so like the government, just right there, we don't have a free market because billions and billions. So there's never been a pure free market, right? And there's never been in recent history, as far as I can tell, a society that's completely squelched like economic incentives, right? I mean,
North Korea,
completely, maybe, right? Yeah, completely. But so for me, the question is less about which of these ideal types that only exists on a whiteboard is to be preferable, and more about like how do we use the power and the opportunity and the resources that are in our hands to make substantive changes for those who are struggling, right? And so on the political side, that's going to require wisdom, but I think we need to recognize that if one of the strengths of free market capitalism is capitalizing on people's worst impulses, right? Like basically saying, like, okay, people are going to be self-motivated, and this system does a better job of like making that better for everybody, that everyone's selfish, then we should also look on the flip side that does living and working in this sort of a society actually make us more selfish? And is a world filled with more selfish people going to lead to the kind of ends that we want as people of faith? So even if we say, hey, we kind of prefer these freer markets, we need to be ready to think about, on the one hand, what kind of systemic checks and balances and constraints do we need? And then on the other hand, how do we like raise up people who are going to use their free market opportunity like to pursue justice, right, in their own economic lives? And I honestly think that oftentimes the way we talk about capitalism is a stiff arming measure. It's like, let's talk about this thing at a bajillion feet to prevent it landing from what I'm doing in my own life.
Diffusion of responsibility.
Yeah, and what access I have with my local political will, my local economic engagement, and et cetera. So I try to stay out of the huge macro, massive questions in some ways. But I do think we can say, like, with a ton of clarity, what we're doing right now does not work for everybody the way it ought to. Yeah. I mean, it's just, you know.
Yeah. So
actually, let me just say this. And
please.
Charity is a part of this, right? Yeah. You talked about how it can make us feel better while we avoid changing things about extra life. You know, in our book, we talk about how, like, right now in the church, we raise up a bunch of money at Thanksgiving to donate turkeys, primarily to working people whose wages are so low they can't buy their own dead gum turkeys.
Yeah, because we own those companies.
Because we own those companies, right? Because those business owners are in our pews. And I think most working class people want to just be able to buy their own freaking turkey. Yeah. There's something sick there. Yeah. Like, there's something wrong there that needs to be rooted out.
I was talking to Will Acuff, a mutual friend of ours, and he runs an organization in Nashville called Corner to Corner, and he told me a story about how he was in an area that's under flourishing, and this truck, this big, van pulled up from some church in like Nebraska or something, and they start like mowing the guy's lawn next to him. And he just like kind of goes over to them, hey guys, really appreciate your hearts and you guys coming to serve us. You're actually taking away the job for one of our small entrepreneurs. So you're actually negatively affecting our local economy. So we appreciate your heart to serve. If you'd like to volunteer in another way, we'd be happy to talk about that kind of like.
Yeah.
Yeah, or just go spend a bunch of money with
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So
when I was a missionary in Kenya, we saw that all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, people dump all this junk that is flooding
the
driving out little market traders who are selling that same stuff, and that's how they make a livelihood. So
I think we just have to think about how all of these issues are talked about, right? Because I think there's this idea in America, and particularly American discourse today, where it's like, these certain people who aren't doing well, they just need to work harder and do certain things, right? But like fundamentally, like our entire country's built off of free labor that was capitalized off of, right? And throughout the course of history, American history, we've had a ton of interventions that have benefited certain people. So we had the GI Bill that disproportionately allowed white people to have middle-class incomes and purchase homes and go to college, right? And so, like, when we just talk about all these things as if we've ever been, I think to your point of like, nothing has ever been a free market. We've never been in a system that didn't provide economic benefits to certain groups in real ways. The reality is, and like particularly in this country, Black people have not had any of that, and are sort of dealing with the legacy of not having had that, right? And so, how do we think about that at this point?
That's right.
Hey guys, hope you're enjoying this show. We're going to be doing a giveaway of Michael's book, Practicing the King's Economy. If you want to enter, find us on Instagram, follow us, and tag a friend in the comments. We will be announcing the winner next Wednesday at noon Central Time. Wanted to also let you know this episode is sponsored by thechurchahead.com, resources and advice for forward-thinking Christian leaders. If you want to love your community systemically and bring about sustainable change, you may be interested in city impact coaching. Learn more at thechurchahead.com. Now, back to our show. One of the things that you wrote about in your book, Michael, the Practicing the King's Economy, and I'm sure you guys can both speak to this, is this question of, okay, I get it, that stuff happened generations ago. For say if I'm a white person, should I be responsible for something that happened before my lifetime? How do you speak to that from both a historical and even theological?
So, I mean, from my perspective, I live in this community where I used to work in South Memphis, which is a majority African American, very low income community. And, again, confronting the stereotypes. In the early 20th century, this was a neighborhood that had lots of working class African Americans who had bought their own homes in the most racist city in America and one of the most racist time periods in America. First Black millionaire in the region built his home there. And local government used eminent domain, white supremacist local government used eminent domain to seize those Black-owned houses, raise them to the ground, and build large segregated government housing, racially segregated government housing. So, like, the myth of like the bootstrap says there's poor communities because that's where poor people kind of end up.
Yeah.
The reality oftentimes is poor people are where they are because the government put them there, right, in this case. And then that takes you up through 1950, which brings us up to the era of redlining, right, which was massive in our communities. And then predatory lending, race-based predatory lending. Okay, so those things, take you well into the late 20th century. But here's the thing. In this city, 2 major national banks have been convicted of race-based redlining and predatory lending in the last 5 years. Yeah. So first thing to say is it just hasn't ended, right? Employers are twice as likely to call somebody back if their resume has a white-sounding name than a black-sounding name. Studies have shown that white applicants with a criminal record do just as well as black applicants without a criminal record. There's studies that show that doctors provide fewer life-saving treatments to black patients. So first thing to say is just like this is as one Native American theologian says, we'll get over it when it's over, right? I mean, in America, that's the reality. But then the other thing I would say theologically for me is I do a lot of work thinking about the year of Jubilee, right? Where you say basically everyone sits under their own vine and fig tree. Like the way to have a safe, flourishing, prosperous, economically growing community is everyone's got a stake, a place to stand, a portion to steward, right? Access to the stuff that makes stuff. So the Israelites come in the promised land, every family gets that. And then the year of Jubilee says every 50 years, if you've lost your farms and fig trees, like if I've gotten Sarah's or she's gotten mine, I get them back.
Big reset button.
The big reset button. But the thing about that is there's no attention to how I lost it. It does not make any difference, right? Like if I stole it from Sarah and then I die, her kids still get it back. And if I got drunk and lost it to Sarah and I die, her kids still have to give it back to my kids. So the idea that inequity only gets solved if we can draw a direct line to me personally does not come from Scripture. It is not something that, the Bible teaches that we are to be concerned with pursuing justice and equity and righteousness at cost, no matter what, right? And so, to me, the whole discourse of like, this wasn't me, I just think it, I get why an American would say that, but I don't get how a Christian could say that.
It's just funny to me, right? Because there's all this distancing of personal responsibility. It's like, I didn't own slaves, I didn't do these things, but everyone's still benefiting from it, right? So if we're really going to all call it even, you give me all that money and all that wealth that you've accumulated, and then we can call it even. It's really not your fault, and you're not doing anything, right? But so long as you're still benefiting from a system that has disproportionately given you things for reasons that are rooted in racism and how our society is set up, it's a little bit crazy to me to be like, now this doesn't count. Like I can't do anything about this. You actually could do things about it to really even the score.
Right. And if you think it was so long ago and that doesn't affect us and that doesn't matter, ask somebody about the Greatest Generation, man. Like in my family, we passed down stories about the relatives that fought in World War I and World War II. Right? Yeah. Those people made a difference in my family's culture, in my family's life, my family's well-being. Well, when we were fighting World War I and World War II, we were at the heart of Jim Crow. In this country, we were lynching thousands of black men and women, right? So this history it's with us. Yeah. And I think it's hard because if you go back to the Jubilee year, if I get Sarah's land...
So walk us through, for people that aren't familiar with the concept of Jubilee, you want to give a basic primer on that?
Yeah, so again, like the idea is the Israelites are coming into the land, God's saying, your life together is going to show the world what life should be like, right? So the idea in Deuteronomy is I'm going to give you these laws, and when the nations look over the fence and see them, they're going to say, what righteous laws, what a wise people, right? There's God. He's there among those people. And a huge part of it is each family has access to a farm. In Micah, you get this vision of everyone will sit under their own vine and fig tree. So everyone has a family farm, which is, in an agricultural economy, that's the family business, right? And then there are all sorts of checks and balances. God knows, okay, you start out fair, everybody gets an equal shot. Like 15 minutes later, people are going to screw that up, right? And there's going to be natural disasters. People are going to get drunk under the tree, and people are going to oppress their neighbor. And all those things, we can see them in Scripture, right? So God knows it's going to get screwed up. So there's all this legislation to try to protect people, to try to keep people in place in the community with a stake. And the big kahuna legislation, like if all else fails, every 50 years, you get the Jubilee year. So you have a huge year-long party, nobody does any work. Can I get an amen? And everybody goes back to their family farm. And again, there's no discussion about how you lost the family farm.
Irrelevant.
Right? And I think, when I think about that story in my own life, so I have inherited, socially and economically speaking, vines and fig trees that were taken from my black brothers and sisters, right? The economic injustice that occurred and has occurred for the last 400 years has accrued to me in some way. And what's hard about that is when I look at my economic life, I can see how I worked hard. I can see how I stayed late in class, how I read every book, how I went to college, how I took every internship, right? I really did work hard to make this vine and fig tree flourish. But the way that we have told history in this country has been so deceptive because it has blinded me to the ways that, I did that work, but I did that work on land, if you will, that was taken from others. So I think
both indigenous peoples as well as
absolutely,
Homestead Act.
And so when people say well, my grandfather worked hard for this, or I worked, the answer is you really did.
Right.
That's great, but that does not address the fundamental inequity that has happened in this country around these racial issues.
And I think it also doesn't address the fact that everybody's working hard. Black people are working hard, right? Other groups are working hard. I think there's this idea that somehow I've worked harder, so I have more, right? And I think that that's a false narrative in and of itself. And I think at this point in time, so there's research coming out of Harvard, right? I think it's the Opportunity Insights Research Project, Raj Chetty, that can really predict what happens to families by zip code. We can literally predict what's going to happen to a child by where they're born in terms of social mobility and their earnings and what's going to happen to their lives. So when that's the case, how much of this is really dictated by how hard you worked?
That's right. And again, I think one of the reasons to pay attention to things like the Jubilee and the biblical witness on this stuff is whatever you think about capitalism, it is a fundamentally individualistic worldview.
Yeah, for sure.
And the worldview, the Christian worldview, is a fundamentally communal worldview, right? And so even that sense of I've worked hard obscures the fact that I'm a part of a community, right? I depend on others, others depend on me, and there are other people in the community whose work has not paid off, not been valued. Or it's even been stolen in different ways.
Well, and I think there's a real cost to our individualism and the way that we do things in our society, right? And I don't think that cost is just to people who are lacking in resources or money. There's a cost to everybody. And when I think about even just families and family structures and the way that my mom was raised in terms of my grandmother and her siblings and the networks and spending time at our family farm and having all of this sort of support system to lean on, even versus my own life and what will probably be my future children's lives, it looks vastly different, right? And so when you, we are communal people, and when you lose that and you don't have some element of that, right, what does that mean for our lives, for the lives of our children? And I think it connects to why we have such a hard time supporting one another, loving one another, being around one another, because it's really you and your thing. It's just and I don't think people were meant to operate in that way.
That's the myth, right? In Western culture, is that I can do it. I don't need to depend on anybody. I march to the beat of my own drum. I sing the song of myself, right? And we are what all that we can tell, whether from the study of the Bible or study from human relations, humans, as my friend Brian Figert puts it this way, humans are hardwired to connect, right? And so one of the shocking things that Brian points out in our book is that over the last 60 years, since 70 years since 1950, we've seen massive economic growth and a corresponding decrease in happiness.
Yeah.
Happiness has either stayed the same, self-reward happiness has stayed the same or gone down,
Yeah.
and a massive increase in suicide and mental health
and the life
whatever.
expectancy is starting to go down in America.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Sarah. We're made for community,
Right.
and it's deadly to reject that ultimately.
I think there's something, and I don't know what study it is or where it was, but it's like up to 70,000, you get happier and happier,
Yes,
and
I
then you
heard
just
this.
stop, right?
Yeah.
And then that's just it.
Right.
And I think this speaks to that, right?
Yeah, it's almost like those baby studies where they showed the babies that didn't get any touch for a couple of years and they just like died. You know, I don't know if it's a couple of years, but you know that study I'm talking about. But relationship or relational, like hardwired to connect, like you said.
Yeah, and so like I know I keep going back to the Jubilee. I actually have a child named Jubilee, so I'm really into this idea. She's the only Jubilee cooler than the biblical one because it's my little girl. But like again, if you think about that, like when I first started teaching about the Jubilee, okay, like it's this giant reset button. Yeah. Like people are like, well, is God a communist? Does he not understand economic insanity? It's like no, like God just cares so much about each family. Yeah. Having a place to stand, being able to be a part of the community. God cares so much about the neighborhood, right, that he's unwilling to allow any neighbors' continuous accumulation to go on in such a way that it negatively affects the neighborhood, right? I mean, it's just, he cares so much about the community, I think.
Well, and I think it comes down to the question of, like, what does it really mean to love your neighbors, too?
Yeah.
Right? What does that really look like? And I think, and this is the byproduct of the individualism of us not being around each other, but it's very difficult for us. I mean, so many of us don't even know who our neighbors are, particularly millennials. I mean, even myself in my apartment, I don't know who's around the
here,
4 people are around me. I mean, that's like mind-boggling when you think about how close we are in physical proximity.
Right. Yeah, so you mentioned the Jubilee a number of times. Zooming out a little bit, for New Testament Christians, what should our relationship with Old Testament laws and ethics be in light of the life of Christ? Yeah.
I mean, frankly, I don't even like the language of New Testament Christians. Because, I mean, to me, we are Christians who have the Bible, you know? Yeah. Sure. And we live in the age of the church and all that. But, you know, the Old Testament, it's kind of like if the Old Testament was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Sure. You know, when Jesus went in Luke 4 in his first sermon to explain his mission, what does it mean to be the Messiah? He quotes Isaiah 61, who's referring to the year of Jubilee.
Leviticus 25.
Yeah. So this year of Jubilee thing that we're talking about, which has captured my imagination. Clearly captured Jesus' imagination as well. Right. When the early church shared their possessions in Acts 2 and 4, and it says, there were no needy persons among them. That's a direct citation of Deuteronomy 15, where the way that you get no needy persons among them is that you lend freely, but you forgive debts in the 7th year. So when Jesus is dying on the cross, he goes to the Psalms, right? Like in the book of Revelation, they say scholars think the book of Revelation references the Old Testament more than any other book in the New Testament, but it never quotes it hardly. It's just like oozing out, right? So I think the Old Testament is critical to our faith and practice. Specifically in the economic area, you know, we're not in an agrarian economy anymore, right? So we don't. The primary factor of production, the primary driver in our economy is not land. It's things like knowledge or wealth, finance, and so we have to think differently. And we're also not in a theocracy, right? Like, so in Israel, God is king. He writes the law and he gives it to you. And the laws about economics are connected to all these other laws about like who you worship and stuff, right? So we've got to... we can't just pick it up in the Old Testament and drop it down in the 21st century. But I'm really taken by Chris Wright's idea that these biblical laws are paradigms. They're like when I learned a language, you know, you learn a language paradigm, like I walk, I walked, I will walk, he walks, she walks, they walk, you know, and you learn how the verbs conjugate or whatever. And once you've learned one paradigm, you can do that paradigm with other verbs. But then some of them are irregular and some of them, you know, and so you got to think critically about how the paradigm moves from one context to another.
Functional equivalence.
Yeah. So when I'm thinking about a year, like a thing like the Year of Jubilee, I'm thinking about what does it look like for the community of faith, say that every single person should have equitable access to the economy to such an extent that they can be a full participant in the neighborhood, right? And we're going to have to think about what that looks like differently based on the differences, you know? But I think there's no doubt that the Jubilee year, or we do a lot in our book with the gleaning laws, or the debt laws around debt, can inspire us to think creatively in a new context about how to pursue an economy that looks more like God's kingdom. And frankly, Christians have spent too much time defending that, going back to the whiteboard theory of economics, and too little time just using their enormous economic and human capital resources to do justice and mercy. Like, even if we say, okay, free market capitalism does the best job of taking selfish people and turning their selfishness into good, we're not supposed to be selfish, right? Like, we're not supposed to be living like that. And when you think about, like, I mean, I know you've done a lot of work with investments, but like, think about the money that's held up in church pension funds and just right there. I mean, we are an enormously powerful group of people in terms of our economic resources, and we just have punted, you know.
Well,
and God's given us all this beautiful stuff to think about and try to live out, you know.
And to make matters worse, a lot of those funds are actually making money off of ingest materials. And so it's a double whammy.
So let me say one more thing. Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, I think to that point, and I think this is a byproduct of how our economy is set up now, right? But like, we feel really distanced from those things. Like, we're making these investments that are in these things that, like, for these companies that do something that just make us more money. So I don't know what they're doing, but like, I'm not actually an owner in this company, even though I own stock, right? And I think that's a fundamental challenge, right? Like, when you don't have to see it, when you're really distanced from something, when you have proximity to an issue, when you don't have proximity to people. So this is the byproduct of how segregated our society is. When you're not around someone else, it's very easy to other them, and it's very easy to downplay the negative externalities of all of those decisions.
That's right. So in the Old Testament, the triad, the orphan, the immigrant, and the poor. Right? And if you're an Old Testament Israelite receiving that law, you've got names and faces for all those people, and they live right outside, and you're actually afraid that you could become one of those people if disaster strikes. Right? They're not like some charitable case way over there, you know, and so that proximity forces the matter.
Do you know how quickly things would change in our society if people actually had to experience the things we're talking about? Even as we talked about, you know, we talk about post-secondary education, the reality is most of the folks in the adult education realm we're talking about went to 4-year school and have no frame of reference for what it's like, or what it's like to be a working parent, or what it's and trying to go back to school, right? And so there's a lack of empathy and a lack of understanding for what the experience and process looks like. And people, and to take a step further, people are like, well, just work harder and just make it work, make it happen.
That's right. This is part of, I think, where the paradigm of these economic laws is so helpful, because if you think about, like, anybody who spent any time in church, right, any of your listeners has been told to give money, okay? And they may have even heard, I think it's Wesley's famous thing, like, earn all you can, give all you can, right? Like, I want to make as much money as I can so I can give as much money away, right? And if you think about that, that takes if your economic life is an equation, Christian justice and mercy in America has focused entirely on the money in my pocket after the real economic work is done. What am I going to do with that? I'm assuming you have a paycheck. What are you going to do with that? Right? And the Old Testament talks about that. It says you need to, in the third year, your tithe goes to feed the orphan and the immigrant and the poor, and you should give generously. But the Old Testament also says that all the stuff on the other side of the equal sign, like how you treat the land you work on, how you treat the animals that you work with, how you treat the workers that you work with, what you pay people, when you pay them, how you lend to other producers. The way we make money, the way we earn money is something that God cares deeply about. And I bet most of us have never heard a sermon, not one sermon, about how people get treated in the actual workplaces that we work in. And so even if we can't pick up, you know, Deuteronomy 15 and drop it into 21st century, what we can say is God cares every bit as much about the way that you earn and produce as he does with what you do with the results.
Right. Right.
So fundamentally, Christian teaching has missed, in America, has just missed this huge thing, right? And it works with the capitalist ideology because, like, just make as much as you can, and then we'll, the nonprofit people will come and try to get some of the leftovers.
Right.
Versus saying, what would it look like to see every area of our economic lives as an opportunity for love and justice and mercy.
Well, and there's just a fundamental dehumanization of people in this process, right? And it's like you're working, you're doing things that are important to me, but I don't even want to know what that looks like. Yeah. I don't want to know. Right.
You're a labor cost, and somebody's spreadsheet. One of the guys whose story we tell in the book, who's a business guy who's really recognized how much opportunity he has to love and care for his employees and welcome different sorts of employees in. He told me one time, Michael, now I look at my payroll as profit. So I go look at my sheet and I look at how much money we compensate all of our people. And I say, look how much money we've made.
Right.
Like that's other business leaders are saying this is a problem to be solved that we're spending all this money on people. And he's saying Jesus has given us all the opportunity to earn. I mean, what an incredible paradigm shift.
What's the purpose of business? Business is designed to be a blessing to our communities. The Abrahamic covenant, we're blessed to be a blessing to all nations. And if we just look at business as a means to our own happiness or satisfaction, that's actually very much missing the point of what God intended business to be. I taught an economic class to high schoolers in the state of California's migrant education program this summer. And I challenged one of the discussion questions I gave them. I said, okay, why should you start a business? What's the purpose of business? And of course, all of them said, to make money. I said, okay, so let's say you made $1 million next year and you never saw your family, you had no relationship with your kids, you hated your job, and you had to work 80 hours a week, but you made a ton of money. Is that fulfilling the purpose for business? And well, no. And so I said, okay, well, let's talk about what it actually is. And what we got to is actually to create a more flourishing life for you and the people around you. And if we start off with the wrong purpose of business, we actually become a slave to the system, whether we're on a part of that system that takes money away from us or gives more money to us.
I think we have to have some honest conversations about greed and the role greed plays in people's lives, right? And so why is it, and you'll see this time and time again with different people, you're earning more and more and more, but you're not necessarily giving away more. You're not necessarily doing more with that, right?
That's a struggle for me.
It's a struggle for me too, right? And I think it's a real byproduct of our society and how things are set up, but it's also, in terms of the Bible and what we learn, like it's also a real thing that is very difficult for people, right? Why is it that people hoard things and hoard resources and feel like they need more and feel like they never have enough, even though they have more than enough, right? Where is that coming from, and how do we really combat that, and how do we use the church to have conversations both about that on an individual level, but then also a communal level as well?
And do you think that has to do, like I tend to think that has to do with the individualism again. Like I cannot imagine having enough because no one is going to take care of me but me.
Right.
So it's like
it's a lack of faith.
There's
in God's ability.
There's nobody looking out for me but me. So there's no point at which I can say enough. Now I can invest in my community.
And I think it's a real byproduct of money. I mean, plenty of scriptures about money and what it can do to you and what can happen to you, right? And so it's just things aren't in isolation. Everything has an impact, right? And so earning more, having more, being able to do more, all of those things shape you and shape your fiber. And how do you think about that, right? And so like some of the early advice I got, right, is like be really thoughtful when you don't have as much when you're younger about what you're going to do later, because once you're there,
it's too late. But you've got some momentum. That's right. It reminds me of the guy in the Jesus parable who has the big kind of like windfall, and he's like, I'm going to build bigger barns. And if you read that passage, like he says I or mine like 12 times. Like, I know what I will do. I will build myself bigger barns for me. So, and even at the end he says, I will say to myself, self. It's like, who's missing? I ask my students when I teach on this passage, who's missing? everybody, right?
Yeah.
Not just God, but like anybody.
Yeah.
They're all missing,
Right.
you know? And I think money has that power.
It does. And I think we're fed this idea that having more stuff or having more money leads to happiness or some personal fulfillment that it never really leads to. And so you're like, well, maybe I just don't have enough. I just need to get more. And I'll get closer to that, right? So you have people who are you know, have a family of 4 living in a 7-bedroom home, like never spend time with each other, right? And it's like, if I just have something else, then it will sort of fill this intrinsic human void that I have. And that's never the case.
I think another thing that, like, this reality that we're talking about makes me think of is so often when we talk about what God requires of us, socially or economically, it feels like really bad news if you're doing well. Like, it's like, oh, what am I going to have to give up? What am I going to have to, you know? And I was just talking to 2 business owners whose stories we tell in the book this week, and they both were giving testimony to this reality of, like, there's never enough money, it won't make you happy. But they are now experiencing, like, tremendous joy at work. Right? Like, this is a better way of life. Like, they have taught me this generous way of life is a better way of life. Treating my business or my economic resources as belonging to God and therefore to be a blessing to the community. This is a better way of life.
Over the course of my life, I've been around a lot of people who have a lot of money and have done a lot of things with their money. And what I have found to be true are the people who have lived like they have far less and have done other things with their money and have some clarity around their values and where they get happiness and it being rooted not in that, have been the happiest, right? And have had the most sense of self and sense of purpose. But it's hard to get to when you're in a society that tells you the opposite. Right. But I do think it to be true, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So one question for both of you guys here in Memphis. You guys go to the same church, downtown church. You know, just a mere few blocks away from the National Civil Rights Museum and these different iconic, you know, I Am a Man Plaza and these places. On the top of your church's website, it says multi-ethnic, multi-class Memphis. Why is that so important and so significant in this town to have a multi-ethnic, multi-class church?
Man.
I can speak first to, like, why it's so important for me. I think as you do this work, right, so we're inherently at the collective dealing with economic injustice, and we're dealing with really difficult issues all the time. I think both in this work, but also in our current time, it can be very easy to have a us versus them mentality about everything. And that fundamentally, you know, Jesus was not like, make sure you love on the progressive liberals. Like, really love them. Like, show them love, right? I think that fundamentally is counter to what I believe to be true. I also think it's really important to be in environments where you're around other people to see the humanity in everybody. And I think when you're so isolated, it can become very difficult to do that, particularly when you're in a society where there are folks who have a lot and there are folks who don't, and there are folks who are being oppressed in different ways, et cetera. So for me personally, I think it aligns to what I think Jesus was really saying when he said love everyone, love people, as you would love yourself, right? And what that looks like lived out, and it wasn't segmented by neighborhood, it wasn't segmented by by race or by political affiliation. So, and as I think about making progress against some of these issues, how can we not engage with each other? At the end of the day, like, even if I didn't want to have a conversation about wealth or wanted things to, how can I not have a conversation when there are the wealth disparities we're talking about, we're trying to solve these issues, how can I not have a conversation with people who are wealthy? Like, it just seems impossible to me on a fundamental level. So
that's really good.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say so. One of the key shifts we talk about in the book is moving from out of a soup kitchen mentality. So when we think about poverty and injustice, the typical way we think about that is like, some people have, some people don't have. Let's get the people who have to give the people who don't. That's the soup kitchen model. And in the course writing the book, we really started describing what we call the potluck model. So not a soup kitchen where everyone gets fed, but a potluck where everybody brings a plate. And that means everyone's a giver to everyone and a receiver from everyone. And what that means in an inequitable society is that some of us, when we show up to the potluck table, we have to learn how to be receivers, right? So people like me have been trained to see ourselves as givers, right? And we carry around these horrifying Messiah complexes because we've been told, like, you are the change, you know? So we expect to be serving the soup, but we don't expect to be receiving the plate.
Right.
And churches are in the potluck business, right? They're in the people business. They're in the people gathering, the reweaving of communities. And so the church is one of the main places where I need to experience the potluck for my own transformation, so that Jesus, in the hands and feet of my neighbor, can confront the idols in my heart. Right?
That's really good.
And I think that, you know, I've been living in our neighborhood now for 8 or 9 years, and I'm very passionate and excited about and trying to think about and contribute to these large-scale justice issues. But at the end of the day, one of the things that matters most to me, like these days, is who I come home to as family. Right? And right now, I come home to downtown church in South Memphis and a different kind of family that represents the hands and feet of Jesus in my life. I need those plates, right? And so I think that's what it's about. And I think it's really easy to get the multis in the same room. It's really hard to have a real potluck. You know, because when you if you're in a church potluck, somebody's getting mad at somebody for bringing somebody else's special dish, and there's going to be real genuine tension, and you know, and so I think a lot of times the cross-cultural thing has been right people in the room, but we're not really experiencing mutual transformation. And I think in our church we know that that's a challenge, and we're seeking that mutual transformation, and that's why it continues to be a really powerful place for me.
That's so good. Well, thank you guys for sharing so much about your stories. I love getting to hear how you guys are working together in the context of your community, in the context of your church, how you guys met, how you're drawn upon, you know, your different backgrounds and the theology, and you're, you know, being all over the country and having the education that you did. It's so beautiful to see those weaving together, and then you guys pouring out your lives for others. So thank you for sharing that, and also for sharing with our listeners today.
Absolutely.
It's really fun.
Thank you.
Hey, how's it going? Man, that was so much fun. It's one thing to hear from an Ivy League grad, it's another thing to hear from someone who wrote a book on economics, but it's another thing to hear from people that are living it out in the trenches, practicing what they preach as a lifestyle. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. If you're new here, I want to thank you for tuning in. If you want, you can press subscribe, keep in touch with what we're doing. I'd also love it if you can rate and review this podcast. That really helps us out a lot. If you have been around for a little while or just really believe in this vision of creative cross-cultural Christianity, visit praisehands.com/donate. Your monthly support enables us to do what we do. So thank you so much. Well, guys, that's it. See you next week.